If you believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to be the only one of this decade, you might be right. But in order to make such a forecast with confidence would require us to know for sure how China is going to behave. You already know that this country has been threatening to invade Taiwan for some time now, and I'm sure many of you would think that sooner or later the island will likely become the next Ukraine. But what if we told you that there are those who think that ultimately the Asian Ukraine could be Vietnam and not Taiwan? And keep in mind, we are not talking about mere speculation. There are plenty of arguments to believe that this risk exists.
Tension rises between China, Vietnam, and the Philippines over disputed islands.
In fact, China has even sunk Vietnamese fishing boats in the South China Sea. But let's be honest, this is nothing new for Vietnam. After all, the two countries were already at war in 1979, just after the end of the famous Civil War in which the United States intervened. But wait a minute. Aren't they supposed to be both communist regime countries? Didn't international socialism unite them? Yes, both were, and supposedly still are, staunch communist regimes, but when it comes to power struggles, ideology takes a back seat. The fact is that it should come as no surprise that Vietnam is trying to strengthen itself as much as possible to avoid another possible Chinese invasion. And what can I say? History tells us that this is the smartest move it can make. And not surprisingly, this is something that, as we will see, is of great interest to the United States. I mean, think about it. The United States wants to curb Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, an objective shared by Vietnam, a country that could play a crucial role in that project. With almost 100 million inhabitants and impressive economic growth in recent years, Vietnam is gradually emerging as another future regional counterweight to China. One more, alongside Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, possibly India, and so many other countries in the area. China's position is not as strong as it might appear at first glance. However, we must not forget that Vietnam is still a communist dictatorship, and making alliances with authoritarian regimes can lead to a lot of problems. Just look at the NATO situation with Turkey. But we'll talk about that in another video. For now, the question is, can the West really trust Vietnam? To what extent could it become a reliable military partner for the United States? Could tensions between Vietnam and China end up provoking another war? Today, we're going to answer all of these questions, but first, let's look at a bit of really interesting history.
Crossroads of Asian communism.
When we look at history and how China and Vietnam are organized internally, we see that at first glance, they basically appear to be parallel realities. Both countries carried out socialist revolutions, both established communist dictatorships that are still in place, and both began to reform their economies in order to open up to the international market. Vietnam started its economic reform in 1986 with Doi Moi, that is 8 years after Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms were launched in China. The fact is that both countries began to promote private ownership of agricultural property and in general in the rest of the economy. They also boosted foreign investment and intensified their trade relations with the rest of the world. Thanks to these changes, they eventually reaped a juicy result. As you can see, their economies began to take off. As you can see, China, which began its reforms almost a decade earlier, distanced itself from Vietnam, especially when it joined the World Trade Organization at the beginning of the 21st century. Nevertheless, overall, the two countries have followed a more than remarkable trajectory. In just 30 years, Vietnam has multiplied the real value of its production by 12 times, while China has increased its own by almost 20 times. And the truth is that we are talking about two countries with many similarities, but that, at the same time, are also very different. In the case of Vietnam, in addition to arriving almost a decade late to the wave of economic reforms, it must be taken into account that when it did finally arrive, this country had just gone through two wars, a civil war in which the United States participated, pretty famously, and later a war against China, which showed up in a defense of the Cambodian regime that committed one of the most extensive acts of genocide in history. That of Pol Pot. In general, we can say that Vietnam embraced reforms when it was poorer and even had more problems of all kinds than China. In part, that difference explains the current gap. Of course, today, the differences go beyond the purely economic realm.
China, between collective power and the personalism of Xi Jinping.
Exactly. While in recent years, personalism taken to the extreme has regained strength with Xi Jinping in China, in Vietnam, things look different. And proof of that is news stories like this one.
Vietnam President Nguyen Xuan quits amid Communist Party corruption crackdown.
You see, in China since 1989, the General Secretary of the Communist Party has also been the president of the country. In Vietnam, on the other hand, this seems unthinkable today. In fact, the Vietnamese communist dictatorship rests on 4 pillars: the General Secretariat, the Prime Minister, the President, and the leader of the National Assembly. Since Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969, each of these positions has been held by different people who function, in a way, as counterweights to each other. In fact, the National Assembly of Vietnam, which is obviously not democratic, at least has some real activity. It can even veto resolutions and, if necessary, propose motions of confidence against the Prime Minister. So far, this has allowed the official apparatus to be somewhat more oxygenated. Meanwhile, in China, there was the alternation of the leader and the current political elites. But with Xi Jinping, all of that has disappeared. So what does all this mean? Basically, no one in Vietnam can change course rapidly as Xi Jinping can in China. And it also generally means fewer restrictions for the general population. For example, while in China Facebook and YouTube are completely blocked, in Vietnam there is free access, albeit with some restrictions, even to videos that criticize the Communist Party. But apart from the domestic political project, the area where we find the biggest differences between the two countries is mainly in their policy in the South China Sea. Although, well, they also have one important thing in common there. Both countries claim the same territories. And that means that tensions could flare up and history could repeat itself again. Don't forget that both countries were at war as recently as 1979. The question is, how does Vietnam hope to prevent tension from flaring up with its northern neighbor? Well, let's find out.
From Russia with love.
It is inevitable. Every time we hear about Vietnam, we immediately think of that war in which dozens of movies have been made, and which the United States was involved in supporting the south of the country with tens and tens of thousands of soldiers. To give you an idea, in 1968, the North American power had almost 600,000 soldiers deployed in this country. In total, the United States participated in this war for 12 very long years. But I'm sure what many of you didn't know is that right after this war ended, China invaded Vietnam in 1979. And apparently today things would be much different. Vietnam's exposure to China remains enormous. Look at this map. If you pay attention, geographically, Vietnam is totally at the mercy of China, either by its border in the north, which is where the Chinese invaded in 1979, or by the coast where, in addition to being practically surrounded, they would face the largest navy by number of ships in the whole world. And let's not forget that to the southwest, there is Cambodia, an ally of China, and then there is Laos, which could change sides at the convenience of the highest bidder. Not surprisingly, faced with such a scenario, the question is, can Vietnam really have a clearly independent discourse? This is basically the reason why Vietnam has been moving closer and closer to countries such as Japan and India in recent years, both militarily and commercially. But let's be honest, the friendship between these countries is rather superficial. If we really want to identify one who has always been Vietnam's best friend, we have to go to the country that has been in all the headlines around the world this past year. Exactly. We're talking about Russia. Since the Ho Chi Minh era, Moscow's influence in the country has already been infinitely greater than that of Beijing. In a way, this has to do with much of the fact that the roots of Vietnam's communist thinking come directly from Soviet Marxism-Leninism. It is not surprising, therefore, that its ties with the Soviet Union were so close, which explains to a large extent why the United States took the Vietnam War so seriously, a conflict in which North Vietnamese troops were supported and assisted by the Soviet Union, which is exactly what happened again when China invaded the country in 1979 in retaliation for Vietnam attacking and overthrowing the bloody Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Whether the invasion was coming from the Americans or the Chinese, the Soviet Union, the most loyal partner of communist Vietnam, helped the country by sending a lot of weapons such as anti-aircraft missiles, light machine guns, and the infamous AK-47 assault rifle. The point is that if their relations were already close, from that era on, their friendship grew much stronger. In fact, today, Russia remains the largest arms partner of the Vietnamese army. Russia even has preferential access to one of the most important Vietnamese bases, the one in Cam Ranh Bay. But pay attention, because that's not the end of it. Vietnam did not rely on the Soviet Union and today's Russia just to get weapons. Economic cooperation has also been key during this time. Do you want an example? Well, in recent years, Vietnam has tried to extract oil in the South China Sea with the help of a lot of multinationals. For example, the Spanish company Repsol. However, we are talking about extraction from disputed territories, and naturally, the oil was going to come out faster and with fewer problems if some Russian state-owned company got involved and managed to intimidate China a little bit. Just a little bit. Particularly for fear of damaging its relations with Moscow, or rather Xi Jinping's determination to maintain those relationships. And of course, the first to jump on this opportunity was Rosneft, although it later sold its entire stake to a company that I cannot pronounce, another Russian state-owned energy company. It begins with a Z. That's the best I can do. So let me ask you a question. How do you think Vietnam repays Russia's favors? Well, news stories like this are a pretty good indication.
Vietnam and Thailand abstain from UN vote to condemn Russia's Ukraine annexation.
Exactly. Vietnam is one of the few countries in the world that avoids condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it makes sense. If it wasn't for the constant support of the Soviet Union in the past and the current Russia today, Vietnam would probably not be what it is today. But of course, if China were to take the initiative and punish or change the Vietnamese government, or even invade the country and turn it into a satellite state, the Russians would be of no help. Today, given the new capabilities of the Chinese army and the manifest weaknesses of Russia, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for Moscow to be of any help to them. And make no mistake about it, this is crystal clear to the decision makers in Hanoi. They have one of the world's major powers on their doorstep, a power that is increasingly expansionist and with which they do not get along particularly well. And in any case, they do not want to be a satellite country. To avoid a possible clash, in recent years, Hanoi has been trying to improve its relations with Beijing. This is not just a territorial or military issue. To put it in perspective, almost 40% of all Vietnamese imports come from China, including integrated circuits, telephones, semiconductors. In short, practically everything the country needs to develop technologically. This explains, for example, why both countries have carried out dozens of military cooperation exercises during the current century. And above all, it explains the foreign policy based on the philosophy of the 3 no's. Not to allow foreign military bases in Vietnam, not to be part of military alliances, and not to support one country in its fight against another. All of this just in order to not anger China. But what if this strategy was a mistake? Nevertheless, tensions in the South China Sea with China have been rising over the past decade, and the situation in the region is no longer to be taken lightly. Watch this space.
Leaving the past behind.
We've told you before how Vietnam embarked on a series of pro-market economic reforms starting in 1986. It's something we talked about in detail in a past video here on VisualPolitik. But for those of you who haven't seen it or simply don't remember it, at the beginning, these reforms were limited to the agricultural sector and later jumped to the rest of the economic sectors. One of the most important was the pursuit of the country's industrialization at all costs. In order to succeed, this required receiving and courting investors from the rest of the world. And trust me, they took it very seriously. Nowadays, it is not uncommon to see brands from all over the world producing in Vietnam. We are talking about companies like Samsung, H&M, Adidas, Nike, and Foxconn. In fact, Vietnam's largest customer by far is the United States. This is not surprising. Relations with the North American superpower have improved greatly in recent years. Gone are the times of war and mistrust. In 1995, the two countries formally restored diplomatic relations, and in 2000, they signed a bilateral trade agreement. In 2007, Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization with Washington's explicit support, and in 2016, the United States completely lifted the arms embargo on Vietnam, allowing for greater cooperation on security and defense issues. We could even see images like this one. Since then, the two countries have conducted numerous joint military exercises and routinely collaborate on maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, while we have told you that Vietnam has tried to get along as well as possible with China, what explains its sudden desire to create a link with its historical arch-enemy and China's current great adversary? Well, beyond economic issues, the truth is that in Hanoi, they do not trust Beijing at all. In fact, in 2014, tension between the two countries reached an extreme level when China brought a semi-submersible oil platform to explore and exploit oil within Vietnamese maritime territory. And not only that, the construction of artificial islands around the Spratly and Paracel archipelagos, which Vietnam claims as its own, has caused tension to grow in the region, especially because of the military hardware that China is installing on these islands. That is why in Hanoi, they now seem to understand that neither Moscow nor Beijing are their safest bets, but instead, they need to look to the United States and its orbit of allied countries in the area. Of course, Washington has seen this shift as a stroke of good fortune, as another potential partner to add to its already long list of countries angry or suspicious of China. And in a way, that's what explains news stories like these.
29th of March 2018, the United States transfers 6 Metal Shark patrol boats to Vietnam. 20th of November 2019, US gift ship to Vietnam to boost patrols in disputed South China Sea. 17th of December 2022. Analysis. Vietnam shift gears on arms trade as it loosens ties with Russia.
Now, instead of buying Russian weapons, it is American, South Korean, and Israeli weapons that are flooding into Vietnam. Now, does this mean that Vietnam is going to change its three no's philosophy and throw itself completely into the arms of Uncle Sam? Well, definitely not. Vietnam is a strange case of a country that right now seems to want to get along with Beijing, Moscow, and Washington all at the same time. And make no mistake, Vietnam is still a communist dictatorship. Western political and democratic forces are not part of the communist country, and this limits the confidence that the United States places in Vietnam. Not surprisingly, it is practically impossible to imagine Vietnam intervening alongside the United States in Taiwan to prevent an attack by China. But for now, the questions are over to you. If you were Vietnam, who would you side with? Moscow, Beijing, or Washington? Leave us your answers in the comments below and let's open a respectable debate. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you very much for watching, all the best, and I'll see you next time.